relationships. We saw it at various levels in how violence or, in our day, domestic disputes just really comes down to the sinfulness of two people or groups or something having equal claims of authority. And I said ultimately, the heart of man wants to have authority over himself, and I mean man as mankind. Is every person, if left to themselves, we're going to have a situation like in the book of Judges where every man does what's right in his own eyes. That's the ultimate reality that we live in. And then I gave proofs that we live under authority from all kinds of evidence of life, and seen from the scriptures, whether it's to groups as we see now, whether the government, in relationships, in your jobs. All of these ways we are all under authority of some context. And from that we got into what are some potential sources or claims for ultimate authority. And we've been going through these. We had external claims. In other words, is when a person sees authority outside themselves, it's not within, and they claim. An example would be government. Government is, there are some that believe that government is the ultimate authority and you need to submit to government. We talk about other groups, etc. Then we went through internal claims where what are some things within us that would sort of help us or think that it's an ultimate reason for authority. We talked about affections or feelings or the will, beliefs, things such as that. From that, we moved into the final example of what happens when you actually combine. In other words, as we looked at, can you have a source of, someone claim a source of authority where they said they were making external claims or internal claims. And then I gave a couple examples from the scriptures. It's a little bit past this. A couple examples from the scriptures where the context shows claims for authority with multiple reasons why it could possibly be the ultimate authority. I gave an example from Philippians 3, 4, and 6 from Paul's life, because Paul in Philippians, the problem is that some false teachers came in. They were called Judaizers. Judaizers they were those Jews had supposedly converted to Christian religion, but after conversion they believed that you had to keep the law, and the first step in keeping the law was for circumcision to occur. If you weren't circumcised as a Gentile, then you weren't saved. That was their main doctrine. And in addition, you had to follow all the dietary laws. In other words, if they would have won everybody here post-conversion, if you're a Christian, you would have had to keep all the Levitical laws, right? All of that would have happened. So anyway, Paul then gives his arguments on if he were like the Judaizers, what are his qualifications to be an authority? And we see this in Philippians 3, and we see some of them up there. In regards to religious tradition, he was circumcised the 8th day. In other words, it wasn't just that he was circumcised. Later in life, from conversion, it's that he was born into a Jewish family, and he was circumcised on the 8th day as prescription of the Levitical law. He had the national privilege. He grew up underneath the covenants given to Israel, because he's of the nation of Israel. He has a full hereditary genealogy of the tribe of Benjamin, which means that Paul, the apostle, can trace his genealogy all the way back to the person of Benjamin. His parentage, the Hebrew of Hebrews, what that means is that he didn't just have one parent that was a Jew, it's that both parents were full Jews. He was also his education, he's a Pharisee. We talk about that education is sometimes used as a reason why a person has authority, and we actually sort of assume it. In other words, the more a person knows about a certain subject, we send them off to school to become an expert. That's sort of the word we use. Well, Paul was a Pharisee, which was a person who was very devout to the law, and they studied up until by the age of 12. They had to have the Pentateuch memorized. That means in the Hebrew, they did it orally. In fact, when we get in later, I'm going to put some of the Hebrew scriptures up from the original, or not the original. But some of the systems, a group called the Masoretes came on how they had markings to help them understand how it was pronounced and how to divide certain phrases and sections. And so then when you understand when it said that Jesus opened up and he came to the place in Isaiah, well, that wasn't random. It was actually a set reading schedule. Anyway, all that education happened during the time when he was a Pharisee. That's what Pharisees had to do. They had to go and jump through certain hoops in order to be called a Pharisee. That's his education. So he had a very strict education with regards to the Mosaic law. He was also very zealous. That's an internal qualification. We talked about zeal is sometimes used. Well, that person must really believe it, therefore that makes them an authority, right? They're passionate for something. He was, in his zeal, he was a persecutor of the church. He wanted to destroy the church. He was the one going to the leaders, the Sanhedrin, and asking for the letters to wipe out the Christian church. Ethically, though, he was blameless. According to the law, he had no evidence against himself. So if you look at him, he had everything going for him as far as an authority. But everything was wrong. He had no authority to do what he was doing, which was to destroy the church. You can also have the false apostles in Corinth, in 2 Corinthians. That's chapters 10 through 13. Some of the evidences for why they claim that they were the super apostles. That's Paul isn't he's using that word sarcastically, but what they were actually saying is that we're above the apostles. There are the apostles of Christ, but we actually have more authority than they do. And here were some of the reasons. They had fame. They were famous. In other words, we sort of understand it in our culture that if you're famous, somehow you have authority to speak on a whole wide range of subjects. The reason that we can see this in 2 Corinthians is that they charge money for the gospel. We call that a speaking fee. In other words, the more money that they could charge, it showed they were more famous, and then the more famous they are, the more authority they have. They had letters of commendation. These were outside the church. In other words, is they could have someone of some kind of authority write them a letter saying these people are approved and stamped, and we sort of do that today. Sometimes actually it's followed in church practice, which is a good thing, because we say if you want to become a member of the church, it's either by baptism or by letter. You come from a different church, they write you a letter saying ethically you've been following the real church. Of course, the problem is now with breakdowns of churches, it really isn't followed anymore, but it used to be. But anyway, these came with letters of commendation from their education or from their speaking arrangements, basically saying that they were great, and there it is. They were healthy, they had a pleasing appearance. In other words, the Apostle Paul was sick a lot. We know from when he was traveling through Galatia that the reason why he stopped in the Galatian area is because he was too sick to travel on. And we know that in Corinth that these super apostles, as they call, were blasting Paul, basically saying he's always sick, he doesn't look good, he's not handsome, he's small, he's not that kind of presence you should have, and that when you're a person of authority. So the better you look and the more healthy you are, or the healthier you are, the more authority you have. And of course, they had it. They had intellectual acumen. What it basically means is they saw themselves as the intellectual elite. One way. The false apostles of Corinth said that they had superior rhetoric. Basically, is they could give a speech better than someone else could. They could do the poetry, and they could use the flowery language, and they could have the turn of phrase which really gets it. They could come up with the slogans like the "Yes, you cans" and anything else, and really get the people moving and cheering. And because of that, because they were able to do that, they had more authority. And finally, they also claimed to be from Jewish heritage. They were Hebrews of Israel. Anyway, from all of this, though, the end result is that Paul says that they are false apostles. They make themselves appear as apostles of light, as servants of Satan. All of those together, not individually, but all of them together, did not add any weight to their authority. Right? So basically, authority doesn't come from claims external in the created realm or internal within us. They all break down ultimately. Now, why? And that's what we're going to deal with today. Reasons why appeals to authority on any of the traits that we've talked about up to this point, whether internal or external, are insufficient to validate or authenticate authority. In other words, if I came up in front of you, this is hypothetical, if I came up in front of you and says, everyone here needs to listen to me because, and I start giving a list of all of the reasons, right? Let's say I say my education, let's say where I'm born, let's say my parentage, let's say because I know somebody, right? Or I came from somebody else, right? If I came up with all those reasons, then why should you reject that? What is the authority? That's the next section, but why should that be rejected? Number one, the power of God. The power of God. This comes from 1 Corinthians 2, verses 2 through 4. Interesting. This is Paul again in Corinth. And my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, that's the rhetoric, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Think about that. basically is the Corinthian church had accepted these false apostles under certain cases. And imagine then someone is able to come in and generate sort of a rah-rah attitude, and everyone gets passionate about certain things, and there's a huge movement. But in the end, it's not based on truth, it's based upon the wisdom of men. It's the ability of men to manipulate responses out of you. It's not based upon the Spirit convicting the heart to transform the person within with conviction. That's what Paul's saying here. It's based upon the wisdom of men, not the power of God. So one of the reasons why you can apply that then to some of these, authority, internal or external, one of the reasons why we reject it is that God wants the glory to convict the heart himself through the application of truth within. Okay? If you were to accept what I say blindly or 100% without checking the scriptures first, it could be that convictions that happen aren't coming from the power of God and the working of the Spirit, but from my own wisdom. Right? It could be coming from me. Right? And I'll be responsible for that as a teacher. There are warnings given to teachers for that. But in this case, we are responsible to make sure that God gets the glory for the demonstration of his power. Power here is not the miraculous sign gifts. It's the conviction of the Spirit to persuade you into the truth. So that's the number one reason, the power of God. Number two, the boast in God. Remember how I said about glory? Let me read 1 Corinthians 1, same chapter, verses 26 through 29. For consider your calling, brethren, that's where God called them, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. But God has chosen the foolish things of this world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. Now, you would think, well, how does this apply? That list there is how the super apostles at that time thought the church would grow more quickly. And guess what? It's repeated today. Let me replace it with some modern day. If we had some people that were smarter in the church, if we had some people that had great connections in government, or that were rich, or that were famous, we could get our message out so much better and so much more quickly. That's the list. Not many wise, not many mighty, not many noble. The weak, they don't have power in themselves. The shame. In fact, that the base things, in other words, is these in that society, remember, it was mostly slaves that were converting to Christianity. There were not many rich and powerful and connected people at that time that were converting to Christianity. Basically, you had slaves and a few slave masters. We have some of the evidences in the scriptures. When those in authority were converted, they're actually noted. But most of the time, they weren't noted. And notice, in the context, it says, God chose them for a reason. He made it this way for a reason. Here's why. So that he may nullify the things that are. Basically, let me put it this way. Throughout history, the Christian church has mostly advanced through persecutions, and it's the people that have no power and no authority and no influence and no money and no means to advance the truth other than their conviction in the truth and willing to die for it. It's mostly in the history of the church has grown through the blood of those who believe it. And what happens, though, is that, therefore, you ask the question, why does the church expand? Why does the church expand? Because that's how God chose it. In the end, though, it's no man may boast before God. You can't then say, well, the reason why the church grew is because we had this really famous person up front giving the message. And that person should get the glory. So basically is the reason why God has chosen these things is so that the boast can only be that God is the one who accomplishes it. So, or therefore, if we intentionally choose authorities or appeal to authorities, we are actually taking away from the ability to boast that God alone does it. It doesn't mean that you can't have these things in order to accomplish it, but if we make that our intent, we actually take away from boasting in God. We may be confused. We may not know. It's amazing, that last one, the things that are not. If you're reading along up there, that little phrase, and the base things of the world and despises go, the things that are not. That's the non-existent ones. It's basically, as the list go down, he's basically getting lower and lower. It's not that they don't have money. It's not that they're spies or rejected upon society. There's actually a level at which they say they don't even exist. They're invisible to society. And God has chosen them. So think about all that list, those lists that we have, whether internal, the qualities a person can possess, or the externals. None of that matters. God chooses them, because then when the results of transformation occur and strength and power come, it only comes from God. There's no confusion. Didn't Paul say this in 2 Corinthians 12? This isn't in your syllabus. The reason why God didn't remove the thorn in his flesh, however it's interpreted at this point, the reason why God didn't remove the thorn in the flesh for the Apostle Paul is because that in his weakness, God is strong. Right? My grace is sufficient. For when I am weak, Paul says, then I am strong. When he removes himself. So in this case, a lot of times those that may come to the church or those that are saved have nothing to do with their rank in society. How society views them as a means of authority.
Could you, I know this is just a little,
Sure.
give us your take on the likelihood of what the thorn in the flesh is.
I actually think it's false teachers. I think it's false teachers who follow Paul around.
Okay.
I don't think it's physical.
So you don't think it's sin, you don't think it's an ailment, you
No.
don't think it's false teachers.
I think he had ailments. But I don't think he had a particular one that was given by God particularly.
Do you think he had any sin?
Oh yeah, yeah.
No,
There's actually a couple instances when we get into soteriology many months from now. We'll actually get into some points where I think there's evidence in the scriptures that the apostles, there's evidence that they sinned. And the Apostle Paul, it's hard to find one, but I think there's one in the book of Acts where you can see what he did that was wrong. It's when he divided the Pharisees and the Sadducees and his conscience was pricked. Yeah. Remember that? He said it before and he says, I'm on trial for the hope in the resurrection. He divides the assembly. Later on he says, I shouldn't have done that, basically. So, but anyway, we're getting off track. So thorn in the flesh, I think it's the false teachers who followed him around, even though he did have that. Anyway.
You don't think it could have been something that different societies or different individuals have different thorns? It's not a thorn, it's not a false teacher in one person, but something else.
Well, again, this is getting way off track. That particular context, it's made clear. And actually, it's really not translated thorn, it's stake. It's something, it's not a prick. It's something that's driven through his heart, which means that it completely dominates him all the time. And the study's been done, I'll get off track, I'm sorry. The study's been done if you actually follow the Apostle Paul's travels. That basically the pattern was there was a group that followed him, and everywhere he went, people would come in after him and try to disrupt and destroy the church. That's why we have so many letters. So what it seems that is Paul has interceded for God to take away the fact that every time he leaves a church, these false apostles come in right after him and destroy his ministry. So what does the Apostle Paul want done? He wants them removed. Stop it. And it says in the context, a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. So it's not that a messenger of Satan is afflicting Paul right away, which now we have two doctrines that are hard to prove. You know, that it's an ailment, and it's an ailment coming from a demon. But rather it's a messenger who is a particular person who is permitted to follow the Apostle Paul around everywhere he goes, which is why in many contexts, what's going on is not hypothetical. There is a person in the church that has followed Paul to destroy the ministry. Paul wants that person removed, because above all, he wants the truth in the church established in maturity. But God has permitted it to keep him humble, because imagine the Apostle Paul going around saying, I've built all these churches, it's of me. And he goes, and notice, the thorn in the flesh was given to keep him humble because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations and the ministry that God has given him. And it keeps him humble because everywhere he goes, the ministry is destroyed or upset because of a person. And God's permitted it, and it keeps him weak, because then it's all by the grace of God. And anyway, that's my opinion. You guys can have a thorn in the flesh as far as physical. But anyway, getting back to this, either way, boasting in God is removed if other authorities are appealed to. Okay? Now, here's another one, 1 Corinthians 1:26. Now, this is actually in the verse verses we just read, and it says according to the flesh. And I pull that phrase out particularly. Notice it says, for consider your brethren, there are not many wise according to the flesh. According to the flesh. The thing is that what he's trying to divide there is there's a wisdom that comes from God, and there's a wisdom that comes from sort of our regular education. But that phrase, according to the flesh, with Paul, comes down to a rather negative view. We have the ideas of fleshly. We have where fleshly is something that's inherently sinful. And in 1 Corinthians, you'll see when you read through chapters 1 and 2, that according to the flesh takes on that negative tone, where basically is a wisdom that's according to the flesh is something that really derives itself from the sinful attitudes of the heart. So why don't we want to appeal to things where wisdom comes from within, or comes from our education? Or as James says, it's the more the demonic wisdom. It's not the humble wisdom. Well, it's because if we actually appeal to it as a source of authority, we could be doing things just that comes from ourselves, and it's sinful. So you take away from the power of God, or we could confuse boasting in God with the glory of God. And another reason why we don't appeal to these things of authority is that it's really just, these are means according to the flesh. They're things that come naturally from us. And we go back to the choice of Saul as king. Think about it. The choice of Saul as king is why did the people want, or what kind of king did they want? A king like all the other nations. That's what they wanted. That was their request. And they got exactly what they asked for. Be careful what you ask for, because God may give it. Right? Not every answered prayer, if you want to think of it, is really a good thing. Anyway, it could be fleshly. Another reason why we don't go to these sources of authority, or why we should reject them, is that they're enslaving. So we're not looking at what's wrong with the authority or something in between, but rather the end result of actually taking it as an authority and appealing to it and submitting unto it can lead to your slavery. Galatians 4:9. Okay? But now that you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how is that you turn back again to the weak and worthless elements to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? Now, a little bit of context. Galatians, Paul wrote Galatia because, again, the Judaizers had come in and said you had to be circumcised to be saved. Right? But they made the appeal to their own authority based upon letters of commendation. Supposedly they came from James, the leader of the Jerusalem church, the half-brother of Christ. Supposedly they came in and they even drew Peter away. Remember the context. They even drew Peter away to where he was now hypocritical, and Paul rebuked him. But now Paul is turning to the Galatians and basically saying, did you believe in vain? Did I preach the gospel to you in vain? Because here's what they say. How does a person become more like Christ? How does it begin and how does it end? And what's everything in between? Is it by keeping the law? Or is it by grace? Okay? So based upon submitting to an authority that was incorrect, the result was that they were now enslaved to the elements of the law again. Do not eat, do not touch those things. So in other words is authorities, it's not just that you take away from boasting in God at that point, or that they're inherently sinful in some cases, or that it distracts from the power of God. But also the end result was that you could be enslaved to things that you never thought you would submit yourself to. You submit to the wrong authority. We know that everyone's under authority in life, right? And actually, right now, everyone in this room, you're either under one or two authorities. You're either under authority to the Spirit of God, or you're under authority to your flesh. There's no in between. Right? That's individual. We're not talking about everything else, but either you're under the Spirit of God, or you're under the flesh. And we know that from Romans. It's called the bondage of the will. Right? It's a very famous treatise by Martin Luther. But everyone here is a slave. Right? There's no such thing as a person becoming free in Christ without also then becoming under the master of Christ. Right? Everyone is a slave their entire life. Problem is, or the choice is under which master you're going to be. In this case, though, sometimes we choose masters that are going to slave us into things that have nothing to do with God, because we appeal to the wrong authority. Such it was with the Galatians, so it can be with us. So we need to be careful. Another reason why to reject. So, which authority? We're coming to that. Next. Vain. Vain. In other words, is the whole book of Ecclesiastes. If you haven't read the book of Ecclesiastes, basically Solomon, I think it's written by Solomon, some may disagree, but I think it's written by Solomon. And Solomon was a very rich and wise king. We know his story from a lot of the Bible stories growing up in Sunday school, etc. We know that people from afar came. He was very rich. He kept the kingdom together. However, the book of Ecclesiastes is one of the interpretations is it's actually his letter of repentance, where he's basically looking back upon his life and seeing how vain it was, how he had the opportunity to do things differently. I actually agree with that. There's another view is that it's a pessimistic letter, that he's looking back on his life and he has no hope. Either way you take it, he lists in the book several common activities or things of authorities that were pleasures or things that can be sought that should not just enhance life, but sort of give the understanding that I've made it and I have that authority. Because he was the king. What other authority can you have? He can do anything he wants. And that's exactly what he said. So from the whole book, he calls it all under the sun, which is vain. And it's a Hebrew word meaning empty, pointless, with no result. If you want to list, there are obviously lists, but I'll just list a couple. Excessive education was one. Going after lots and lots of money. Beautifying things. Sometimes he even says, leaving excessive inheritance for people because you're going to die. Although he also wrote in Proverbs about having inheritance, and it's good for a person to leave inheritance to his children's children. But he's saying some kind of excessive amount. And that's repeated in the New Testament. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. You get ensnared. But basically, he goes through the entire book, and everything that we talked about a lot, I actually didn't want to keep referencing the book of Ecclesiastes because a lot of the authorities or things that we can find pleasure in and we sort of appeal to appear in the book of Ecclesiastes. What's interesting is at the end of the book of Ecclesiastes, he says this is the conclusion of the whole matter. Does anybody know those verses? What's
Conclusion of the matter is fear God.
Say that out loud, please. A little louder.
Conclusion. I like that verse got me through college with all the much studying, weird and all that.
Yeah.
But it says the conclusion of the matter is to fear God and keep His commandments.
Fear God and keep His commandments. He looks over his entire life, how vain it was, how he's basically wasted it, with appeals to authorities and pleasures and things. And at the end of his life, he comes to the conclusion that the only point of life is to fear God and keep His commandments. That's the only thing that makes sense. Interesting. So a lot of these authorities that we appeal to is vain. And I don't mean vain as in, beautifying. I mean it has no purpose and it has no result that's lasting. No result that's lasting. From that, we can actually bring that to the New Testament, and I show little profit. 1 Timothy 4:8. For bodily discipline is only of little profit. Now, this is taken out of context. The context is about godliness. It's interesting, though, the contrast. But basically, that time is along with the idea of being healthy and those things, is you can get so consumed in it that becomes your motive. Remember, the thing about health and how good you look, and is there profit in it? Well, yes, but it's a little. It's just a little bit. The ability of health is so that you can actually do the work of the ministry. He says, so bodily discipline is only of a little profit. He doesn't say no, he says a little bit. The result, though, is that you put all this effort into something that's a little profit, versus the context which says that godliness is a means of great gain. It's where the real substantial growth is. From this, obviously, then we have appealed to it as an authority. Think about it. If it's only of a little profit individually, think about it now where we appeal to it as an authority or whereby we judge everything. Results from that are going to be just little. There's not going to be much there. Or, how about no help? Colossians 2:23. Colossians 2:23. These are matters which have, to be sure, the appearance of wisdom in self-made religion and self-abasement and severe treatment of the body, but are of no value against fleshly indulgence. Sometimes I think Christians appeal to authorities other than the Scriptures. I'm sort of tipping my hand on where we're going to go with this. They appeal to authorities other than the Scriptures because they want some kind of confidence or they want some kind of shortcut against the raging war within, right? Indwelling sin. There's a great book about indwelling sin. by Lunsgaard. He's actually a Presbyterian, but he wrote it. He basically took John Owen's thoughts and rewrote it so that we could actually read it today, because John Owen is very difficult to read. But he rewrote it, indwelling sin, because here's the reality: is as Christians, indwelling sin is always there, right? It's always waging war. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care about what time of night. It doesn't care whether you're alone or in a group of friends. It doesn't matter. It's always going to be trying to advance and enslave again. Right? That's always what it's trying to do. And so as Christians, the problem is that we think there's still some kind of shortcut against it rather than head on, right? Prayer and scriptures. Well, the Colossians thought there was an easier way by accepting the Judaizers' doctrines of keeping the law and certain things, and that made them have the appearance of religion. Notice it says it's the appearance of religion. But it's of no value against fleshly indulgence. It doesn't stop anything.
It's like the hair shirt and the scourging, you know.
Well, I didn't grow up in a Baptist church, but I remember there's an old saying, you know, basically how can you be a good Baptist? It was don't drink, cuss, smoke, or chew, or go with girls or guys that do. Which, of course, there is actually some wisdom. There is some. You know that?
Yeah, I've heard it before.
Yeah, there is some wisdom in that, because we know from the scriptures it says that bad company corrupts good morals. So that's not completely untrue. However, if that's the entire life and the heart isn't dwelt with, if it's all externals, then there's no value. In fact, Jennifer and I had a discussion this week because there's a situation that came up with regards to a view of ministry, not hers and not mine, but there's a view of ministry that we were talking about and how to deal with it, where sanctification was coming by a list of, okay, you have to check this off, 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 you have to do this, do that. And once you go through your checklist, you know that you're growing and you have that confidence. But is that really the case? It says here that there's an appearance of religion and self-abasement and severe treatment. Now you can fill that in, right? They were specifically teaching not to eat and how to treat a certain body, but you can fill it in. It's of no value against fleshly indulgence. The only way to battle the flesh is with the Spirit. That's the only way. The only way the Spirit works is by taking truth against that particular thought. It's the only way. There's no, and if you don't know the truth, just give right in. Right? There's no barricade. Anyway, sometimes appealing to the self, there's no help. So in other words, is they have this appearance. And do we know that there exists in the church today or in other religions this idea that they have this appearance of religion and respectability? Oh, look, they keep it like this, and they live like this, and they dress a certain way. And yet inside, they're raging with sin because there's no value in what they do to stop it. We could mention the Catholic Church and some of the problems with the priests and pedophilia in the United States. We could mention that. That's just an example. It's recent. That's the only reason why I mentioned it. It's not the only one. But it's a blatant example of how conformity to something external has nothing to do with the inside, with the heart.
Which is the point that Hawthorne made in the Scarlet Letter, because Quinn was going around saying, am I the only one who sinned? I must be. I'm the only one wearing the letter A.
Right.
You know.
Yep. So, we have, it takes away from the power of God, boasting of God, vain little profit, no help. It's also momentary. This is from Isaiah 40, verses 6 to 7, and 23 and 24. And I'll explain Isaiah 40 in a minute. Notice there's numerical superiority. All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely all the people are grass. Let's stop for a minute there. Basically, he says all flesh. In other words, if you took all the people in the world together, they all became united, numerical superiority, and they all had a common belief, and somehow, as I said, numbers make you stronger and everyone's united, God can just blow on them and they're gone. Right? Numbers ebb and fade. You can have some people can be all for you today, and the next day they're all against you. Some of our mindset comes from Russia when we work there, and it's the idea of the mob. And we sort of see it in our culture today, right, with the way that media influences and how really it has nothing to do with about seeing whose convictions, it's just about influencing the mob. They just want to shift the mob mentality. The word mob in Russia actually means the herd. Just like cattle. Just go where you need to go. Basically, it's like this: all flesh is grass, and it's momentary. The grass withers, the flower fades, of all together is that everyone here is going to die. We're all going to stand before the Lord. It doesn't matter how many of us come together and shake our fists or how much authority we think we have by appealing to these sources, is in the end, God's going to wipe it all out, and His authority stands. How about government? This is from 23 and 24. He it is who reduces the rulers of earth to nothing, who makes the judges of the earth meaningless. Scarcely have they been planted, scarcely have they been sown, scarcely has their stock taken root in the earth, but it merely blows on them and they wither away, and the storm carries them away like stubble. Now, governments and kings at that time had supreme authority. You ever read a history book on some of the things that they did, and they're conquering their empires. You know, we think we have problems with the fact that we pay taxes a little too much, or we may disagree with some healthcare issues. You know, imagine the Assyrians coming in and crucifying and skinning the people and nailing them to the sides of your city. And then they said, "You submit to me." And in light of those kings, he says, God just blows on them. They're momentary. They're here today and gone tomorrow. It doesn't matter how much authority they have. They're here today and gone tomorrow. Because God is the one with authority. Notice it says, scarcely have been planted. It's just, in other words, is they root themselves in authority that they think they have. And yet God, with His authority, just stubborn. It's like the beach. It just washes them away. It's amazing. It's like dust on the surface. Just wipe it off. It's amazing. And those are, and notice, the rulers of the earth. The idea with that is that it's the collective. He can do it to all of them at a single moment. Which, by the way, is encouraging to us when Jesus returns. Because guess what He's going to do with the rulers of the earth? Just wipe them away. And it's done.
Which is why Jesus said you can render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's,
Sure.
because it doesn't make any difference in the long run.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And one of the reasons is between His first and second coming. And this is when He talks about the first coming He came to save, and the second coming He came to judge, or He's coming to judge. Sort of that's really not really understood. The idea is, though, is if He came to judge the first time, what happens is He would have wiped out all the leaders, and He would have set up His kingdom, and He would have been installed as king. We see Him consistently rejecting that in His first coming. In the second coming, He is going to do that. It's not that He isn't going to. It's not that He won't save in the second one, like whoever may believe or whatever, or that He didn't judge people's sin individually in His first coming. It's that it's a statement with regards to the kingdom. Right? He's allowing the rulers at this time to keep their authorities. He hasn't wiped them away yet. Anyway, I get off track. So all of it's momentary. In other words, if we appeal to authority that's outside, like government or whatever, we can fill in the blank. A group that has some authority, or the rich, you can put the rich in. We want them to sort of help us. We appeal to those things and make that our authority. It's all momentary. It's here today, gone tomorrow. It doesn't have lasting significance. There's another one. This is a big one. I only choose one verse from this, but this word is repeated elsewhere. Colossians 2:4. The reason why we may actually appeal to other authorities is the result of deception. We've been deceived. I say this to you that no one delude you with persuasive arguments. Colossians 2:4. Now in the context, it's again about the false teachers. But the idea of deception occurs over and over and over again. The reason why we may appeal to other authorities other than the Scriptures is because we actually believe it. We've been deceived into thinking that those qualities are better than, or more important than, or will accomplish the goals that we desire rather than the Scriptures. We forget that there's little profit and no help and enslaving, and it's momentary and it's vain, and we take away from God's glory. We forget those things, or we've never believed them, or we don't value them, which is even more important. Maybe we don't value God's glory. Maybe we don't value those. Maybe we really just want those things and our pleasure aligned with that. Or as a result of deception. All right. Finally, a pollution. 2 Corinthians 11:3. But I'm afraid that as the serpent deceived Eve, notice it says deceived there. That's same word, Colossians 2:4. By his craftiness, your mind will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. Now again, 2 Corinthians 11 is a context where Paul is talking to or telling the Corinthian church on why to reject the super apostles that came in to deceive them and establish their own authority. And in that context, he is saying, I am afraid, notice, I am afraid that because of deception, your minds will be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion. One of the things is that if we value as a church, or even in our individual lives, is we want the simplicity of the truth, and we want purity of devotion. We say it's a value. The problem is that when we get ourselves encrusted with all of these other appeals to authority, notice, we are led astray from that. In the Corinthian church, who here believes that the Corinthian church was a pure church? Anyone? Raise your hand. Anyone? What were some problems in the Corinthian church? Anyone? This is not hypothetical.
Sexual morality.
Sexual morality was one of them. What's another?
Oh, no, when they kept going back to the idols.
They kept going back to the idols. What else?
Misuse of spiritual gifts.
Misuse of spiritual gifts. Big one. What else?
There's legal issues, like suing each other.
They were suing each other. That's right. They were suing each other in open court and blaspheming the name of God because they were Christians suing each other in pagan courts. But you haven't made, but what's the first one listed in 1 Corinthians? What's the first problem? Because I don't know if you know how divisions. 1 Corinthians is written, by the way, the first few chapters, actually there's the way is that it seems that the leaders of Corinth, the elders of Corinth, had a list of their problems and they sent a letter to the Apostle Paul. Well, he answers that list in the second half of 1 Corinthians, but he gives his own list in the first half. And the number one thing that he brings up is what? Divisions, factions. And why are there divisions and factions? Because they had different authorities. They are led away from simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. If Christ is not the ultimate authority, there will be divisions of the church. If we appeal to anything else, there will be division. If we think health is the reason, if we think fame is the reason, if we think what our parents said when we were kids is what we should believe, if we think our own personal experiences, if we think our feelings and affections at that time or our pleasures, if that is the appeal to our authority, there will be a division in the church. Period. You can't have, and what happens with divisions? Factions just mean there is a two group of people. There's two group of people that think that they have the authority, and then what happens? Fighting. So notice it says simplicity and purity of devotion to Christ. This isn't just about individual purity, it's about the purity of the body. If we appeal to another authority or permit it for any reason other than the scriptures themselves, God's authority through scripture, then we are led astray. We are deceived and led astray. Ignorant, 2 Corinthians 10:12. Interesting. For we are not bold to class or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves, but when they measure themselves by themselves and compare themselves with themselves, they are without understanding. This is interesting. We are not bold. Actually, it means arrogant and ignorant. To class or compare ourselves with those. In other words, is if we were to sort of present ourselves as the authority, and I say, well, the reason why I should do this is because I start comparing myself with myself. Okay? So I create the standard by which I should be accepted. Then I show how I created it and I meet it. Does that make sense? In other words, is what if I said in order to be an authority, you had to, how tall am I? 5'11". You had to be 5'11", and a short haircut, wear a tie on Sunday maybe. You had to have this kind of education to speak whatever kind of language, and that makes my authority. So now I create the standard, and lo and behold, I fit the standard. Wow. You could fill in the blank. It doesn't matter. I use it as an example. Okay? You could make it regionally. What happens if in the South I had to grow up in a certain area, have a certain parentage, know certain people, like certain foods? I mean, you could fill in the blank. But the end result is that I'm without understanding because all I do is I make the standard and then I fit the standard. I'm my own authority. And that's all rejected. He says they're ignorant. He goes, first, and notice ignorant here isn't that they're not aware. Ignorant is always a willful rejection. In other words, they're arrogant enough to believe that they can create the standard, compare themselves to it, fit it, and then that makes them the authority. As if somehow creating the standard, they have the authority to create the standard in the first place. That's where they're without understanding. So we can't appeal to authorities by creating them. So that's the whole reason to reject all of those externals. In the end, all of them are created by man. Right? It's only authority that has existed eternally, to which we submit. Another one, stem from sinful lusts. In other words, it's one of the reasons why we may appeal to other sources, and these may stem or come from or spout from sinful lusts. And this can come from whether it's from in the source, there's a sinful lust in the source, in other words, the authority of themselves, or it's in the object. Romans 16:18, this is in the source. For such men are slaves, not of our Lord Jesus Christ, but of their own appetites. And by their smooth and flattering speech they deceive, notice, deceive again, the hearts of the unsuspecting. Notice, for such men are slaves. Romans 16 is again the same sort of thing, false teachers. They are slaves of what? Notice how I said you're always a slave. They're not of a slave of the Lord Jesus Christ, they're a slave of their own appetites. Think about it. We appeal to other authorities, and in the end, they're slaves as well. We're not appealing to someone that's free. And then they deceive. Or in the object. I got 4 minutes. Almost done. In the object. 2 Timothy 4:3. They will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires. Once again, in other words, this is the church rejecting someone that preaches the Word of God. And why this may happen is they're going to accumulate themselves teachers. Why? Because they want what they want. And in their end result, the object is in their own desires. So it doesn't matter whether the source is enslaved. It doesn't matter whether those who put themselves under the authority are enslaved. In the end, you reject both because they can stem from sinful lusts. Finally, ignores the limitation of human existence. And I didn't really expand on this because we're going to cover under anthropology. Anthropology is coming up when we talk about what does the Bible have to say about man and his nature. Man and his nature. But ultimately is that mankind is sinful. Sinful means is that as a bearer of the image of God, that it is marred at this point in his relationships, left to himself without redeeming grace. Relationships will fall apart. He will seek his own authority. He will seek to gratify his own pleasures. So in the end, we forget our limitation. Mankind is a slave to his nature. We know this, that can a leper change his spots and make Ethiopian his skin? That's from the scriptures. Let alone can a man do good? Can a man do righteousness? That's the verse from, I think it's Jeremiah. In other words, a leper can't change his spots. It's their nature. Neither can a mankind do righteous deeds. Anyway, conclusion of the whole matter. What remains if all appeals to authority from man to man through man end in ignorance, error, deception, enslavement, pollution, helplessness, sinfulness, and hopelessness? The answer is that a claim to authority must begin, proceed, and conclude completely apart from a man. Knowledge and truth flow out of objective authority. Objective means eternal and external from us. That is inherently possessed. In other words, is the person has it, not because they created it. Right and power to judge, commit resources, and interpret all stem from the same kind of objective authority. There are 2 questions then. Is there such a sovereign objective being that possesses all authority inherently? And if so, how does or did this being communicate himself to mankind? What do you guys think? The answer is yes, there is. It's God, and he has communicated it. The next section is going to be on Revelation, where we talk about communication from the one authoritative being to us. And it doesn't just include the Bible. There are different kinds of revelation. I'm not saying the book of Revelation, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying just scripture or prophecy. We're going to talk about all kinds of revelation, including appearances. We're going to talk about general revelation, which is creation, how creation reveals God. We're going to talk about other means, including, eventually, what he said. Okay? Any questions? No? All right. Let's close in prayer. Mr. Flynn, would you close us, please?
Father, we just thank you for this opportunity we have, Lord, to learn